Hi, I'm Lucy and welcome to Beautifully Unfinished. It's the place where we get the aha moments together. Because if there's one thing I'm learning about life, it is that it very rarely unfolds in a nice, neat, straight line. It would be a nice thought though, wouldn't that? A little roadmap that gets handed to us at birth saying, right Lucy, here you go. This is where you're going. These are the people you're going to meet in your life. These are the bits that are going to hurt like hell, but don't worry, because on page 47, it'll all start making sense. Imagine how much easier it would all be. But no, instead we get to spend an awful lot of our lives standing in the middle of something, wondering what on earth is going on here. Why did it happen? Why doesn't any of this make any sense? That got me thinking this week about something called the butterfly effect. Now, I'm not going to get into the scientific side, but rather my layman's understanding of it. The idea is, in very simple terms, is that something tiny, seemingly insignificant, can set off a chain of events that eventually leads to something enormous. You may have heard of the example of a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world, and through a chain of tiny changes, contributes to a storm somewhere far away. I started wondering, how many butterfly moments have there been in my life? How many tiny decisions, chance meetings, unexpected conversations, closed doors, moments that seemed completely insignificant at the time, actually changed the direction of my life? And then I thought, how many of them did I actually recognize while they're actually happening? Probably none of them. Because that's a strange thing about life. We live it forwards. But often we can only understand it backwards. Hindsight, after all, is a perfect science. And one very simple example for this is the day that I first walked in the gym. Now, let me tell you, I didn't walk into that gym feeling like a strong, empowered midlife woman who decided to transform her life. Absolutely not. I felt stupid, daunted. I felt completely and utterly out of place. I was convinced that I had an enormous invisible label stuck to my forehead saying, crisis in progress. I thought everybody was looking at me. They weren't. But in my head they were. Oh my goodness, then there were the exercises. Apparently, what I thought were lunges were not actually lunges. I thought I was doing them quite well. It just turns out that I was basically galloping like a horse. And apparently, that is not the correct gym technique. Well, who knew that? I didn't. But I went back. And I went back again and again and again. And slowly, something began to change. Not overnight, but slowly I got stronger. Now, 2.5 years later, my body's changing shape. I can do things I couldn't do before. I'm stronger than I was. And that's not just physically. Because of what began as one terrifying decision to walk through those doors of the gym, it's suddenly become so much bigger. One small decision led to another. One workout led to another. A little bit of confidence has now created a whole lot more. And perhaps that is the butterfly effect too. Sometimes we think change happens in one enormous moment, but often it doesn't. Sometimes it begins with something tiny. Walking through a door, trying something badly, galloping when you're supposed to be lunging, and simply going back the next day. One tiny flutter, then another, until one day you look back and you realize, oh, I'm not where I was. And then there are the butterfly moments that arrive when you're least expecting them. Sometimes they arrive late at night in the form of a message. 2 words. You're awake. That was it. Just a tiny message on a screen. At the time, how could I have possibly known what those 2 words would set in motion? I opened that message, and perhaps somewhere in that moment, a butterfly flapped its wings, although it was more like a whole kaleidoscope of butterflies that had suddenly taken up resonance in my stomach. And what started so small grew. So much bigger than those 2 little words could have ever suggested. We can spend years planning our lives, making lists, making sensible decisions, trying to control the direction everything's going in. And then 2 words arrive on your phone late at night, and life quietly changes direction. That is the thing about the butterfly effect. We really recognize the moment that changes everything while we're actually standing in it. There's no flashing sign saying, "Pay attention, Lucy, this moment is important." It just looks like an ordinary moment. A gym door, a message, a conversation, a decision, a yes, a no. Because not every butterfly moment is about something beginning. Sometimes perhaps the butterfly effect begins when something ends. I think we all have those times in our lives when we keep trying to make something work simply because we want it to work so badly. We keep pushing, we keep fixing, we keep hoping. We tell ourselves that if we just try a little bit harder, give it a little bit more time, wait a little bit longer, things will change. And I think that can be one of the hardest things to accept, that something can have been right for a season, but it's still not right forever. That doesn't mean it was a mistake. It doesn't mean that the time we gave to it was wasted. It doesn't erase the good that came from it. Perhaps it simply means that it's part of our story that has come to an end. And sometimes we only discover what's waiting for us once we've loosened the grip on what we've been trying so desperately to hold together. Because while we're using all our energy to keep one door open, we may not even notice the tiny flutter of something else and a new beginning happening somewhere else. And perhaps that's another kind of butterfly effect. The moment you accept that something has run its course. It may feel like an ending, even failure. But perhaps without knowing it, you've just changed the direction of your life. With one tiny decision, one release, one flutter of the wings, and a whole new story begins to quietly appear. And that is where I think we have to be careful, because I struggle sometimes with the phrase, "everything happens for a reason." When you've been through something deeply painful, those words can feel far too simple. There are things that happen in life that I would never call good. There are losses we should never lose, betrayals we should never ask for, endings that break our hearts. There are things that happen that leave us changed forever. So I don't know that I believe every painful thing happens because it was somehow supposed to happen, but I believe that God can take the broken pieces, turn the wrongs, the disappointments, and the things we simply can't understand, and somehow weave them into a story that we cannot yet see. And perhaps that's where faith comes in, because faith can feel easier when everything makes sense. It is so much harder when you're standing in the middle of a mess saying, "Lord, I have absolutely no idea what you're doing here." It's the kind of prayer that is less beautifully worded and more like, "Really, Lord? Is this the plan?" Because there have been times in my life when I simply could not see beyond what was happening right in front of me. All I could see was the loss, the ending, the disappointment, the uncertainty. I couldn't see what might come next because, of course, I wasn't there yet. And I think that's something we forget. We judge our entire story from the chapter that we're currently standing in, because we decide that because something doesn't make sense today, it'll never make sense. We look at one dot and desperately trying to understand the whole picture. But what if we simply don't have enough dots yet? What if something in your life doesn't make sense right now because you're still too close to it? You're still in the middle of living that part of your story where the pieces are scattered all around the table and you cannot yet see how they all fit together. It's a bit like doing a puzzle. You find the 4 corners, you start building the edges. You think you can roughly see what the picture is supposed to look like, but the whole middle is still a jumble of pieces scattered across the table. And perhaps that's where you are right now. You have a few pieces, maybe even a few that fit together, but you don't have the whole picture yet. Maybe one day you will. Perhaps you'll look back and realize that the job that you didn't get led you somewhere else. The move that you didn't want introduced you to people you could never imagine your life without. The relationship that broke you forced you to discover a version of yourself that you forgot had actually existed. The conversation you almost didn't have that changed everything. The tiny decision that seemed to mean absolutely nothing at the time became a turning point. One flutter, then another and another, and somewhere along the way your life quietly changed direction. And perhaps that's one of the most beautiful things about getting older. You have just a lot more dots to join. When you're younger, so much of life is still ahead of you. But as the years go by, you begin to have the extraordinary ability to look back and see connections that your younger self could never, ever have imagined. You begin to realize that some of the moments you thought were endings were actually beginnings. Some of the things that you thought had ruined your plan were quietly redirecting you. Some of the people that you've met, perhaps only for a moment, left something with you that has lasted a lifetime. Maybe that is the butterfly effect of human life. Lives constantly, often without even realizing it. It's a kind word said at exactly the right time. A conversation, a smile, an invitation, a piece of advice, someone believing in you before you believed in yourself, someone saying, "Why don't you try?" Someone saying, "I understand." Or someone simply sitting with you when you didn't need answers. We may never know the ripple effect of those tiny moments. And that works both ways, because you may have been someone else's butterfly moment. You may have said something years ago that they still remember. You may have made someone feel seen when they felt invisible. You may have changed the direction of someone's life and not even known it. We're all walking around thinking our lives are these separate little stories, when actually we're all constantly brushing against each other's lives. Leaving something behind, creating ripples, changing things in ways we may never see. One tiny flutter at a time. And I suppose that brings me back to the question and the title of this episode. What if it hasn't made sense yet? That little word yet. Because if it doesn't make sense, feels final. If it doesn't make sense yet, it leaves the door open. It leaves room for another chapter, another dot, another person, another possibility. I do not have to understand everything immediately. I don't have to force every experience into a nice, neat little explanation. I don't have to know exactly why something is happening while I'm still living through it. Sometimes I can simply say, I don't understand this yet. You're still unfinished. Our stories are still moving. Perhaps there is something happening in your life right now that makes absolutely no sense at all. Perhaps the plan has changed. Maybe a door's closed. Maybe someone's walked into your life unexpectedly, or someone has actually walked out of your life. Perhaps you're standing in the middle of something you never asked for, wondering, how on earth could this be possibly part of my story? Maybe the thing that makes no sense today will become part of the story you tell one day. Maybe you're not at the wrong ending. Maybe you're simply in the middle. You don't have to understand every chapter of what you're living. Sometimes we just have to turn the page, because one day we may look back, we may whisper, "Oh, now I see why that happened." Until next time, remember, you're not finished. You're still becoming. And there's something quite beautiful about that. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you'd like, follow, and subscribe. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.